Welcome, everybody. My name is Federico Negro from the CSPI unit of the ILO, Coordination Support for Peace and Resilience. Welcome to this Peace and Resilience talk today. This is a series of workshops, webinars. Initially, they were workshops, then they became a webinar, and all intended to implement the recommendation 205 and share materials, guides, experiences that we are all doing for implementing the recommendation. The format of these workshops or webinar is that we always try to invite some outsiders, some partners, to have a dialogue with partners and colleagues outside of the ILO in order to really share experiences and learning one another. Today we are presenting the guide for peace and conflict analysis that we have been developing. I just remind you a couple of things. First, that we are recording the webinar and it is going to be uploaded later on the web. So if somebody misses, can go and have a look at it. And also we will have the question and answer session. We really would like to devote a good half hour to that to have a bit of a lively discussion. The 2030 agenda for sustainable development, especially the Sustainable Development Goal number 16 and the Sustaining Peace Agenda and the work around the humanitarian development peace nexus recognize that achieving development outcomes and reducing humanitarian needs is dependent upon preventing and transforming violent conflict. The UN Secretary General has called on all UN entities to integrate the approach to sustaining peace in the strategic planning, to be conflict sensitive, and to regard sustaining peace as a fundamental goal to which their work, so our work as well, should contribute. In line with the United Nations as a whole, the ILO is also placing increasing emphasis on making sure that our intervention make a positive contribution to peace. The link between decent jobs and peace is clear, but this does not mean that all ILO programs, initiatives, projects are automatically conflict sensitive. And to do so, we are now making sure that through some guidance, we are really contributing to peace. This is why we have produced a number of policy papers, various publications, including, for instance, the handbook on how to design, monitor, and evaluate peace-building projects, a number of other guidance like the forthcoming ILO guide in conflict settings, disaster settings, and fragility, the SOP, the standard operating procedures in crisis response. So a number of guidance that are aimed at guiding our work. And we are now today presenting the PCA, this guide. And we ask ourselves a question: why should we conduct a PCA before designing and implementing a program in fragile context? And this is, the answer sounds quite clear, but then it's difficult to put it into action. And because we believe that there cannot be any development without peace and no peace without development. Initiatives based on a good understanding of peace and conflict dynamics are more likely to achieve their decent work goals and contribute as a consequence to peace building. On the other hand, programming that is informed about the situation will find it hard to make a concrete contribution to either peace or decent work, and they may also be likely to fail. So today we are presenting the PCA, and this is another crucial document in a series that we have been doing with a growing collaboration with Interpeace, a Geneva-based NGO here in Geneva, precisely. And before going further, I really would like to invite Martina Zaft here to say a few words on our collaboration and on the role also that an NGO such as Interpeace is playing for helping us in becoming more conflict sensitive and aiming to become peace responsive. Martina, over to you, please.
Thank you, Federico. It's really great to be with all of you today for introducing the PCA that we've developed together. So yeah, as Federico mentioned, I'll just share a few quick words from Interpeace's side. So Interpeace is an international peacebuilding organization, and we're probably more known for our work on the ground. So we work in a variety of countries around the world, really on the ground peacebuilding, strengthening the capacities of societies to manage conflict without violence, both at the grassroots level, but also connecting that with the governments. But in addition, we have a second facet to our mandate, because Interpeace was actually born inside the UN as a pilot project in the mid-90s. And then became an independent organization in 2000, but retained a really strong strategic link with the UN system. And it also gave us the second part of our mandate, which is to collaborate with the UN system and other international actors to continue to learn and enhance how we all contribute to peace in these societies. And increasingly over the last 5-6 years or so, it's become very clear to us that as peace builders, we may play a crucial role to build peace, but really most of the peace building in a broader sense is done by humanitarian and development, human rights, stabilization actors. It's really a whole of system endeavor. And that, of course, also became enshrined in, as Federico cited, the Sustaining Peace Agenda that's really calling for this, the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, etc. So because of that, we've been partnering increasingly with agencies like ILO, but also FAO. We have Julius of FAO here with us today as well, and several others. We work with WHO, with UNFPA, and others. And really trying to figure out how can humanitarian development actors, multi-mandated agencies strengthen their contributions to peace, become conflict sensitive, as Federico mentioned, and then possibly even identify more forward-leaning contributions to peace in alignment with their mandates, and drawing on the very, very positive examples that often exist across organizations like ILO and FAO and others. Because they, in many countries, we see that really important contributions are being made. So it's also about really learning from those and then figuring out how can they inspire even more such action, more deliberate, more research-based and informed, context-informed, context-led actions to strengthen those contributions to peace that we very often already see in many different places and forms. And so it's really great to be working with ILO on this shared endeavor and thinking together how can program teams also in the field really be practically supported to translate these often very high level policy agendas and ambition into concrete action and make it practical on the ground for the benefit of the people that we work with. So it's great to be with you here today to introduce this important step that ILO is taking now.
Thank you very much, Martina. I would like now to introduce the panelists of today, starting with great pleasure from my colleague Nieves Tomé, that I see on my left here. I will tell you a bit more about you later on. We have Julius Jackson from the FAO on my right side, and Phil Vernon from Interpeace here. I will tell you a little bit more about them just before they speak, but before starting, we would like you to do some work, isn't it, Nieves? So let's please launch just a couple of questions that we would like you to answer. I guess you see it in front of you. So can and should ILO programs, projects do more to maximize their contribution to peace in fragile context, in your opinion? So they should do more, yes, no, or maybe you don't know. Please vote. I'm also trying to vote if I can, yes. So please, if people have voted, can you, colleagues, please show the results? Should we do more? Should we? Yes. Okay. Definitely, this is Bulgarian results. With no offense. So definitely, we have a massive understanding that we need to do more. This encourages us to go ahead with the presentation and implement it. Next question, please, Nieves. Do you think ILO colleagues, and if there are no ILO colleagues, think about your program, that in fragile context, those programs are conflict sensitive? Yes, no, I don't know. And let's see the result. And please, panelists, try to address also the audience in your speeches. Here we are quite more balanced. I see that some, yes, are conflict sensitive, which is a great start, 40%. Somebody say no, 18. So there is some work to do, apparently. And then, of course, the 42% that replies, I don't know. We hope that this guide and the work that we are doing will help you to clarify a bit more your views on conflict sensitivity. Now, Nieves, Nieves is a colleague of CSPR, Coordination Support for Peace and Resilience Unit in DevInvest, the Employment Policy Department. Most of the colleagues that deal with fragile situation, they know Nieves already. I call Nieves confidentially Miss Peace, if you allow me. She has been working for about 20 years in the ILO. She has a great experience in various countries. I just name a few: Mozambique, Senegal, Uruguay, Cuba. So she brings to the ILO field experience, wide field experience. But Nieves, please, over to you to introduce us the first part of the guide. Thank you.
Yes, many thanks, Federico. So it's a pleasure to be here, and unfortunately not to see all the colleagues here. Let me just share the screen. Okay. Okay, here it is. So, yeah, before anything, just before going into the subject that Phil is going to introduce, which is the peace and conflict analysis, allow me to just very briefly recall what's the raison d'etre, as we say, of the ILO, and why, based on that, we decided to work a little bit more on that conflict sensitivity approach and peace responsiveness from the coordination support unit. So as you all know, probably because most of that indeed come from the ILO, but it's always good to remember it, because even us in-house, and even me 20 years later, I have a tendency of forgetting that the ILO actually was created by a peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. And it was the first organization that was created on the assumption that there cannot be peace without social justice. And actually those words that I'm not going to try to say in Latin that you see here, are even beneath the foundation stone of the ILO. There is a document where they wrote that sentence when they started building the ILO. So I think we are, at the heart of a peace mandate within the ILO. And to reconfirm this mandate after World War II, there was, of course, the Philadelphia Declaration, but also the Recommendation 71 on transition from war to peace, which was the first recommendation really claiming the role of the social partners and of employment to build peace. And on top of that, and to reaffirm our role on peace, we also have to remember that in 1969, the ILO got the Nobel Prize. And even if it was 50 years ago when the DG went to receive the Nobel Prize at the time, Morse, he used to outline how the ILO had used its unique tripartite and normative mandate for the past 50 years to build, using his word, an infrastructure of peace. And today, 50 years later, we still see the need, and it was reiterated through the Centenary Declaration in 2019, the importance of decent work, employment to ensure that we have sustainable peace. Another very important day for us is, of course, the 2017 adoption of the Recommendation 205. As you know, this recommendation is a landmark instrument for the world of work in addressing concerns that are across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. It really provides our member states, but also our constituents, the measures to generate employment and decent work for recovery, for prevention, but also for peace and resilience during a crisis. This recommendation, it's the only one that exists in the world that really looks also at the key role of employment and decent work. I just have a problem with here, yes. So the ILO for a century relies in a number of vehicles to contribute peace through its normative framework, through its structure. However, as we all know, and as we could see also in the poll question that we ask, we still can do more as ILO to contribute to peace. 99% of you just confirmed it, that we can do much more. And among our partners, and FA will probably share also a similar experience, partners, but also member states, peace builder, employment is often considered as a secondary priority in peace building context. Indeed, there is even research about the conceptual link between employment and decent work, employment and peace, where it says that some evidence is lacking. Even if there is evidence that we need employment, full employment, and countries that have no problem of decent work and employment in general are not in conflict. But we really have to see the way to promote that dimension through a different path. One thing for sure is that violent conflict, climate change, and disaster have staggering economic costs. And there is evidence that there is a link between this unemployment, decent work deficits, etc., and peace. On the other hand, including what we see right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, crisis can really reverse sustainable economic development with large implication for the world of work in terms of availability, but also quality of job. And that's where we really want to focus, and I'll come back to that. Because regarding the quality of jobs, the conflict and widespread violence can increase informal, non-contractual work, can increase illicit work, can exacerbate child labor, etc., and can provoke even more violence. So conflict severely limits the degree to which workers enjoy also basic social protection, fundamental rights at work. And on the other hand, unemployment and decent work deficit can themselves be key contributing factors to conflict. The lack of respect of fundamental rights, such as child labor, is also a cause for conflict. And the scarcity and inequality, again, exclusion, the absence of social dialogue, the absence of a voice of the young people, of women, of excluded population can trigger and exacerbate existing grievances that can lead themselves to more conflict and social unrest. And this is why we really see that it's more important, more than ever, to really work at what we call, everybody's in the UN world now called the humanitarian development peace nexus. As Federico mentioned just before, there is various UN agendas, including the 2013 Agenda for Sustainable Development, all the discussion of the Peace Building Architecture Review that recognize that to achieve development and reducing humanitarian needs, we really need to prevent and transform violent conflict, and that peace is everybody's business. And I think also Martina mentioned that it's not only peace builders that will contribute to peace, that we are all part of it. And again, as Federico said, that there cannot be any peace without development and no development without peace. And that's really at the center of what we want to promote here through the PCA, but through also all the work we're doing on decent work, on decent work and employment for peace. When we look at the nexus, we really have to understand that what the ILO does is promoting bridge between short-term, immediate employment creation when there is a crisis as a humanitarian response. But as ILO, we're not a humanitarian organization and we don't pretend to be. However, we have to be there from the beginning to make sure that we are ready from the start, put in place the approaches to have a long-term employment center and decent work dimension of development that is also conflict sensitive and try to address conflict drivers from the beginning that are linked to the lack of employment, lack of decent work or decent work deficit. Therefore, the development approach will try to address those conflict drivers. For example, short-term investment in infrastructure just after the destruction, after a conflict, can be part as part of longer-term public employment programs, what we call PPPs, and that can lead to a more longer-term infrastructure investment that can also help to generate long-term employment opportunities. So a focus on building infrastructure, assets, services that promote also socioeconomic development, that can increase agricultural productivity and provide care work, support education, give also social protection schemes to the workers, working at the same time with the social social protection schemes that already exist in the country, that also take into consideration climate-related challenges through environmental friendly type of work, green works, etc. It's a way of investing in the future. And these investments are aimed at addressing inequality, not only horizontal inequality among social groups, through access to those productive resources. However, all this have to do in a conflict-sensitive approach, which means that we have to make sure that we don't promote employment or infrastructure for one group and not for the other, that where there was already some grievances existing, or that we might create the grievances through a program that could, if we're not conflict sensitive, reinforce inequality among groups. So that's really the idea of working across the nexus. One concrete example is that we have a specific program that most of you know. It's the Jobs for Peace and Resilience Flagship program. So it's one of our key flagship programs. We have 5 in the ILO. It aims to, it was launched in 2016 actually, and it acknowledged the importance to work across the nexus by pursuing interrelated and mutually reinforcing strategies. So the idea is to deliver quick and tangible benefits in terms of jobs creation, through employment intensive program, for example, at the same time to deliver skills for those young people working, for example, in the investment employment intensive infrastructure development program, enabling also business environment as well as inclusive and effective labor market governance in the longer term. So it's essential to also look at how it can promote economic prospect, intergroup, oops, I went too fast, yeah. It can also at the same time, but then I'll come back to it, also promote social cohesion by promoting intergroup relation between different communities through this type of employment intensive work or skills development or joint enterprise. For example, in Central African Republic, we had put in place with an RBSA a program for marginalized youth in some high conflict risk zones in Bangui and Bangui. And it was achieved by rebuilding deteriorated infrastructure and supporting SME growth among young women and men, while promoting at the same time social cohesion and dialogue among disparate groups and communities from different religions and ethnic background. So it was really a way of creating direct employment, creating the infrastructure needed, and at the same time promoting contact and social cohesion between the community. In Northern Lebanon also, we had a very similar initiative that was actually an experience that we developed through a peace building fund program in 2016 that was a bit of what launched our theory of change that I'm going to present later. this project really aimed in reducing the tension among the group, among the Syrian refugees, among the host community, but also within Lebanese communities. So the idea was really to develop what we call joint ventures, joint enterprise, business startup, and value chain development. But those joint ventures, enterprise actually, were developed with the participation of both community together. And also the value chain, it was in the tomato, I think, and potato value chain and flowers, if I remember well, was also, also linking enterprises from one community with enterprise from the other. So the economic relation between the two communities could increase trust among the community and therefore also contributed to peace. And we have actually a very positive evaluation on it that really show how this project changed the perception of one community towards another. So now just all this to also very quickly present also let's say the new narrative that we have on sustaining peace through employment and decent work. As I said before, often the linkage between employment and peace is not seen by our partners. And this is also due because not always, but let's say a few years ago, we have, but when I say we, I think it's beyond the ILO, and again, maybe Julius will share his experience also on this, but a tendency also of taking for granted that employment creation program in fragile setting will automatically lead to peace, but with an invisible hand, that if you have so many employment created, then we'll have peace. And actually more and more research show that it's not that easy and that simple, and that correlation is not always there. More and more conflicts are protracted, complicated. Some young people go to war, to jihad, while they had a job and they're looking for something else. Sometimes, as we said at the introduction, they look for dignity of voice, something more than just a job or a livelihood. So it has to be more than that. And also another part that is very important linked to the PCA, of course, is the fact that we could see that we cannot do employment program business as usual, as we would say when we work in fragile setting, because whatever we do will have an impact. It can have a positive impact on peace, but also a negative impact. So that it's quite important that if we really want to work on peace and make a difference on peace, we cannot just do business as usual, and we have to make sure that we have an integrated approach where peace building objectives are interlinked with employment. As I mentioned before, some examples, for example, of joint enterprise development that also promotes social cohesion at the same time. And so in this framework, we had that employment program and peace joint statement with the UNDP, World Bank, and PBSO in 2016 that actually stated that theory of change that I'm going to present, that most of you already know, that tried to look at how program beyond just creating livelihood can contribute to peace. So that's kind of the starting point of that peace responsive approach. But from there, we have done many new things, and particularly in partnership with the Peace Building Support Office. And I would insist in particular with our last publication that just came out last month on sustaining peace through decent work and employment, which was jointly developed with the Peace Building Support Office, DPPA, the Department of Peace Building Affairs, from the UN. And it's an important milestone for us, because it's a way of saying, well, you know, since there was all this research saying, well, that linkage is not that clear, but actually that statement really says, well, yes, short-term cash for work, for example, will not contribute to peace. And I think that's very clear. However, employment intensive programs that are fully embedded into a longer term approach, that are conflict sensitive, as the ILO have been implemented, yes, can have a positive impact. A vocational training program that also includes social cohesion dimension, that also include training of those young people to be able to develop conflict management tools, are also responsive and can contribute to peace. Enterprise development that also promote a connection between different community. Social dialogue platform, the participation of and that's very important and key for us, the participation of our constituents, because that's our added value and our speciality that no other organization have. So the importance also, and that's really well stated in this brochure, the importance to strengthening labor and economic institutions to reinforce social dialogue and fundamental principle and rights at work, to make sure that we contribute to peace, to ensure that social partners, the private sector, employers and workers organizations can also be partners and also actors of social, of peace. So this is very, very important also, and was highly highlighted in this brochure. Another point also important, it really insists on the importance to design and implement program in a conflict-sensitive way to contribute proposally to peace by addressing simultaneously those three conflict drivers that I'm gonna present. So, well, this is the handbook that most of you know that we have developed based on that first 2016 brochure with the joint statement. And it's a handbook where we really tried in order to help the ILO to be more peace responsive and to include throughout the project cycle that peace and conflict sensitive dimension with suggestion of different type of initiative that could develop. I just gave many examples of those type of activities. The theory of change is actually, again, is just to remind that whatever we do in a conflict sensitive situation, and if we want to contribute to peace, we have to go beyond looking at economic lack of opportunity as a main conflict driver. That we have to look at all the conflict drivers, and among them, but there is many others, that could be the lack of contact, lack of social cohesion, and the existence of grievances and lack of social justice. And often we forget that in our program, while they are key in our mandate. So it's actually coming back to our mandate. So as I said, you can promote contact through a joint initiative, strengthening economic relationship. You can reduce grievances through our mandate, through social dialogue platform, giving a voice to also youth through trade unions, informal economy association, private sectors that you could promote fundamental rights at work. We just finalized with skills, for example, also very important guide for TVET providers to see how they could systematically include a social cohesion and peaceful coexistence module in any TVET that they would be organizing in a fragile setting. It was developed specifically for refugees and host community context, but it's actually it can be used in any context and fragile setting. So it really shows how we might have to make sure that through vocational training, we put together different community, but also that we give them those skills, social cohesion skills. So this is the kind of activities that we could embed into our program. But to do that, of course, we have to make sure that we address and that we analyze those conflict drivers that are linked to employment decent work deficits and unemployment. And this theory of change can be fully adapted, of course, to the COVID-19 crisis. And again, we always say COVID-19 is just a crisis on top of the crisis. It's exacerbating those conflict drivers that very often already existed. On health issues can create new ones, of course, that could be addressed through an employment program that take into consideration also the lack of access to social protection. We had that publication with WHO and PBSO and Interpeace also that also look and try to address conflict drivers that are linked to the lack of access to health, to social protection, to the vaccine, to employment, to infrastructure, and how those health and employment programs together could also make sure that they address them. I'm sorry, I think I'm gonna finish here. I see Federico nodding. Just to end, I wanted to just give another example before ending of what we mean about program throughout the nexus, and particularly in the context of COVID. It's through also social protection program. We've been talking a lot about cash transfer. So yes, why not? And that's something that is highlighted into the Sustaining Peace publication to look also at conflict driver linked to the access of immediate cash linked to the COVID-19 crisis. But if the response is only cash transfer, it's a short-term response that also could have negative impact if we don't select also the right person, or if we have to make sure that we're not excluding one community compared to another one. But not only that, we have to make sure that when we do cash transfer, especially as ILO, and that's something that it's really rightly addressed in that joint brochure, that it's fully embedded into national protection schemes. So we are sure that those cash transfer also have a longer term approach. So they're really seen throughout the nexus, and at the same time that they are developed in a conflict sensitive way, so to make sure that they're not recuperated or used by one group and excluding another one. So that's another example also of the type of activity in a crisis. So finally, here you see it's something that comes from the handbook that we have developed. It's trying to look at what do we mean when we say in the project cycle, but not only project programming, and Phil is going to mention it, how all this is actually quite important at the programming level, at the decent work country programming level, but also to ensure that the ILO, but not only the ILO, that any organization working on livelihood and employment, that employment and decent work are fully included from the beginning in national peace building and conflict assessments, such as the recovery and peace building assessment of joint UN, World Bank, and EU, so that we look from the beginning at conflict drivers linked to employment deficits. So when we do in our cycle, we start with a situation analysis. If it's in a fragile situation, we have to make sure that that conflict analysis include a conflict, a situation analysis, include a conflict analysis, because any program or project that are designed in a conflict situation need to identify their contribution to peace, to avoid doing harm and prevent program failure also due to a superficial knowledge of the conflict drivers. And it also allows to deepen their understanding of the peace and conflict dynamics and their interaction with decent work and employment issue in this context. And from there, we can see how we can develop specific activity, an ILO initiative that can address those conflict drivers and therefore contribute to peace. And then we have that handbook that can also help us to develop those specific activity, and also an important point that can help us to develop peace building indicator. And this is very hard, but I think that conflict analysis can help us also to look beyond just employment creation or decent work deficit indicator, but also at social cohesion indicators, change of perception, et cetera, of one community towards another, thanks to the program we're developing. So to allow us to start building and sharing knowledge on all this experience that we are having for 1 century now on how employment and decent work can contribute to peace. Sorry, thank you so much. And now with a pleasure, I'll give back the floor to Federico.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nieves, for this overall introduction to the situations of fragility and the need for conflict sensitivity. Working on new things, it's an opportunity to meet new people, and definitely meeting Phil Vernon has been a great pleasure. Phil is a freelance advisor supporting Interpeace in its collaboration with the ILO. Is originally a forester, but Phil has worked in all 3 dimensions of the nexus, which is really an advantage, understanding it all, and was a director of programs for peacebuilding NGO International Alert until 2017. Phil, after interviewing 15 plus colleagues, what you want to tell us? Can you introduce us now the peace and conflict analysis? Over to you.
Thanks, Federico. I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, someone just delivered a package. Share screen. Yeah. Hopefully, you can now see my screen. I can get it. Okay, good. So. Just Federico, nod if you can hear me. Good, great, thanks. So you said it was a pleasure to meet me, but actually the pleasure was all mine. So thank you very much. It was really good to meet those 15 or more staff that I spoke to in helping to develop this peace and conflict analysis guidance. And I think it was a pleasure, not just because those meetings were pleasurable because of the people concerned, but it really reminded me how close ILO is in its mission and mandate and its activities to peace building, which is something I've worked on for so many years, and so it's a real pleasure to sort of learn that as well as be part of this process. What I'll cover in this is I'll try and give you a sense of the PCA guidance in the short time that we've got to do it. Of course, the document's been sent out. You can all read it. Perhaps you've all had a look at it already. I'll cover sort of 3 main topics. One more or less rapidly. Just a reminder of why it's good to use a PCA as part of program design and implementation. A short a bit on some practical considerations. I won't dwell too much on those. There's much more detail in the documents itself. And then focus on the analysis itself. So what is it we ask? How does it help us? Why do we use a PCA? 3 quick slides here. First of all, I think, Federico, you mentioned this, but the purpose of a PCA, and this comes from the document, is to improve our programming, to make it as relevant as it can possibly be and as effective as it can possibly be in fragile contexts. And how does it do that? It deepens our understanding of the peace and conflict dynamics, and specifically of their interactions with decent work issues, which interest us as ILO, interest you as ILO, in the context where we're operating. And that allows us, or it allows ILO to articulate how your initiatives can purposefully contribute to peace and also avoid causing harm, because we all know that's possible with conflict sensitivity concerns. And I've underlined or highlighted the word purposefully there, because as Nieves said, just because there is an inherent link between issues of work and stability and peace, it doesn't mean necessarily that any programming we do on work is necessarily going to lead to more stabilization and more peace. We have to program that into our projects and programs, just like we do with anything else. And as the poll result just confirmed, there's a widespread feeling that we can do more, ILO can do more. So that's just something I would reiterate there. And now I'm not going to dwell on this. This is not going to become a seminar on what peace means, but one of the ways to sort of explain peace is to say that as an equation, peace is a function. It doesn't equal, they're not added together. It's a function of improved stability, fairness of access to livelihoods and services and opportunities, social cohesion, or perhaps one can call it, functional, trusting, vertical and horizontal relationships between people and peoples, and between citizens and the people who have power over them. And then the possibility of continuing to make development progress. Right? So it's a simplified way of thinking about what is peace. And if you look at those 4 elements, ILO is relevant to all 4 of them. In 1919, ILO was founded as a stabilization measure. So we know it's relevant to stability. We know ILO is interested in fairness and access to livelihoods and to some extent services. We know from what Nieves has just told us, because it's in the terms of reference that you just very helpfully highlighted, Nieves, that the Jobs for Peace and Resilience is targeting improved horizontal relationships in terms of, for example, of group dynamics and groups knowing each other and having contact with each other across divisions in society, but also improving conflict resolution mechanisms and mechanisms for resolving grievances between what we might call vertical relationships. And we know that the ILO is about development progress. So it's just a kind of interesting reminder of how the relevance of ILO and decent work issues is to peace and peace to the ILO. And then I just wanted to pick up this idea of peace responsiveness, which is an idea which has been coined by Interpeace. But I think Interpeace will be the first to say that it's just a coining of an idea which is already quite intuitive. And we've talked about it in the PCA guidance as well. So peace response, if you look at this diagram, you've effectively, it may look complicated, but it's not. Effectively, you've got an x-axis along the top, which goes from a conflict insensitive programming all the way through to, on the right-hand side, programming which proactively and intentionally contributes to peace. And then if you look at the y-axis, you go from what we don't show, which is conflict insensitivity. And then on the sort of positive side, we got the red bar, which is conflict sensitive programming, which is trying to minimize harm, do no harm. You've got peace responsiveness, which introduces the idea of not just doing no harm, but aiming to make a positive contribution to peace outcomes. And then you've got your kind of specialized peace building activities that Interpeace does in its work in the field. And just to illustrate what we're talking about here, I'll take 3 generic ILO projects which don't exist. I made these up. So we've got a conflict insensitive project at the bottom left-hand corner, which is where ILO is selecting beneficiaries from only one ethnic group in an area where inter-ethnic conflict has been a real issue. Obviously, the possibility here is that this is going to deepen resentment and divisions and could cause a prolongation of conflict. These are very simple examples. A better example, let's call this a conflict sensitive approach, which is trying to make sure the project does no harm. ILO understands the risk of the inherent in the first example. So the ILO team in the country concerned deliberately chooses activities in its project design, which are open to all ethnic groups. So there's no exclusion by design, and it facilitates inclusive participation across the different ethnicities. And this therefore reduces the risk of deepening resentment and divisions through the programming. So that's conflict sensitive. And then if we go one step further towards what we might call a peace responsiveness approach, we've got ILO using its project planning processes and institutional development methods to bring members of different ethnic groups together in planning together project activities, but not just stopping at the project, also building the local governance, if you like, capacity, so that after the project is finished, there is a stronger capacity across those communities to work together in planning more activities and hopefully in resolving conflicts which occur. So it's a very simple and simplistic way of pointing out what we're talking about here. So we're talking about, in line with the UN Sustaining Peace Agenda, all the UN agencies are trying to move from the bottom left-hand corner of that, hopefully no one is still there, up towards the bottom right-hand corner of the diagram. And we're talking about moving in that direction. Different projects and different programs will move further towards the specialized peace building activities. No one, I think, is expecting ILO to become a specialized peace building agency, at least not to my knowledge. So that's a little bit about the why we use PCA, use the PCA. Just in terms of practical considerations, and I won't talk too much about this, but this is a diagram from the guidance. And when I spoke to all of those 15 plus people, what became clear to me was that we needed to develop a guidance, and to Neves and Federico, was we needed to develop a guidance which was going to be relevant to people at different stages in the programming cycle. So what we're showing on this diagram is what we would love, I would love as an outsider, I would love ILO to be using a peace and conflict analysis at the strategic level as often as possible, so that the whole country strategy, the Decent Work Country program, is kind of designed to not just improve decent work opportunities, et cetera, but also to make a contribution to peace, to move it towards the top right-hand corner of that last diagram. And that can be in developing decent work country programs, but it could also be in partnership assessments done as parts of common country assessments and so on, or with FAO, for example, other UN agencies. But we recognize that's not always going to be the case. So the PCA is also designed for people designing specific projects, even where there is no strategy which has already been informed by a peace and conflict assessment. And the diagram shows that it can be used for developing a new project design, designing a new ILO or project or initiative, but also even where you've got a project which is already operating. If you see the need or the opportunity to make the project a bit more peace responsive, you can do a peace and conflict assessment as part of that project's implementation. And we know, for example, that very often, and we all have this experience, you've got to design a project to meet a donor deadline and you've only got 2 or 3 weeks to do it, and maybe even less. You probably think there isn't enough time to do a PCA, and there certainly isn't enough time to do a completely comprehensive PCA. So what you can do in that situation is do the best you can during the project design, at least pay attention to the peace and conflict dynamics as far as it's possible, but then put a PCA into the inception phase. And there's a project in Cameroon in its inception phase at the moment, run by the Enterprise Department, which is doing just that. It's just, I think, just about to hire a consultant to help do a PCA as part of the inception phase, so that at least when the full project plan is developed, the peace and conflict dynamics are incorporated into that. The only other things I would add at this point about the on the sort of practical considerations side is, so who does these PCAs? Now, again, speaking with my own independent hat on, I would love to be able to say it should always be done in-house by ILO staff, because that way it's completely owned and understood by the team. But I recognize that very often, as with most organizations, you're often going to have to bring in a consultant to do this. That can be fine. I would say make sure the consultant is someone who's collaborative. Make sure that the terms of reference for the consultant don't allow them to just do the assessment and then walk away, the analysis and walk away. It should be done in a participatory way. It should have as much ownership as possible from within the ILO team or teams, as well as potentially with partners from government and other sort of partnerships you might have. And that can also be an opportunity for capacity building within the ILO team and office. In terms of the methods which are used, these are details in the document, and I'm not going to go into them now. But the point I would make is that they're very familiar methods. Just because it's peace and conflict, if you feel that you're not expert in peace and conflict analysis, it may not matter too much, because you probably do have expertise in analysis. And so especially if you're working alongside a consultant who does have that expertise, a lot of the methodology used is very familiar. A lot of it's done using secondary data, because a lot of peace and conflict analysis has already been done in most of the places where we work. So we can simply use that and update it. When updating it, we use methods like focus group discussions, key informant interviews, analysis workshops. We try to maximize participation so we get as many voices as possible. So we're making sure that the different perceptions in society are taken into account in our understanding of the place where we're working. So I won't go into it more than that now, but that's what I was going to say about the practical considerations front. And then on the analysis itself, it's an incremental process. It's shown here as being formed of 3 stages. They're sort of stages which merge into each other, but there is a linear element to this. I think of peace and conflict analysis as being a bit like doing an oil painting, not that I've ever done one. If one is doing a landscape painting, one first of all sketches out with broad strokes, one sketches out the landscape. So that's the snapshot of peace and conflict trends. And then one starts to fill in more details, and one looks at the relationship between the different things in the landscape. And that's where the drivers of peace and their conflict with the interactions with decent work come in, because we're not just looking at the context here, we're looking at what's relevant for ILO at that point. And then you've got a whole landscape painting, which is full of detail. Then what you do is you take a step back and you look at the whole thing and you synthesize it and you say, okay, what is this telling me? What is this telling us about our programming for ILO in this context with our partners? So we broaden it and then we narrow it. Very important to start off at the broad level. It doesn't really matter if we're developing a program in, let's say, southern Ethiopia. We should look at the national angle as well. And I don't just mean the capital, I mean what's going on in the rest of the country. Because as we see in a country like Ethiopia, the conflict in the north has already led to more conflicts breaking out in other parts of the country, because everything is connected. So it's really important to start at the national, even the geostrategic level to some extent, before zooming down into the particular geographic or thematic area of our project. Of course, start with the context, don't start with ILO. This is something I find I've said to a lot of organizations over the years. Human instinct is always when doing strategy to say, what can I do or what can we do? That's correct for strategy. But strategic analysis starts with what is happening in the context without me. And then you interpose yourself or your organization into the context. So the beginning of the analysis has to be of the context without us. And then we add ourselves. So if we take these 3 stages fairly rapidly, stage 1 is what I call the snapshot. This is when we sketch out the landscape. 4 core questions here. What are the kinds of conflicts going on? Who's involved? Who's doing them and who's being hurt? What are the main trends and potential openings for peace? Don't forget, this is not a conflict analysis. This is a peace and conflict analysis, and we're looking for openings for peace that we can broaden or build upon. So really important to look at openings for peace. So if we were doing a peace and conflict analysis in Libya right now, we would probably be looking really closely at the opportunities which have been created by the new political agreement, which was finally arrived at and hopefully will be sustained at the beginning of the year, because that creates all sorts of new opportunities for collaboration between municipalities and the national government, as well as between the different factions within all the different instances, which can be built upon and strengthened, hopefully. And then when we look at the last point, how have these phenomena changed and evolved, we're looking for trends here. So in Kenya, for example, a famous example often given is that in Kenya, if you look at a graph of violence, it always spikes around the time of general elections. So if you're thinking about trends in Kenya, if you're thinking about program design, where are we in terms of the electoral cycle? That would feed into our program design. And then stage 2 is when we look much more closely. This is when we start to sketch in more of the details in the landscape and the people in the landscape. And as I said, the relations between them. And what we do here is we have 5 dimensions, lenses that we look through. We look from the perspective of safety and security, governance, politics and justice, economy and livelihoods, general well-being, and then back to that idea of vertical and horizontal relations or social cohesion that I mentioned before. And for each of those, we have a set of generic questions which we would ask in any peace and conflict analysis. But because this is for ILO, we have specific questions which relate to each of those areas, which the ILO should ask, or we recommend looking at. And so, for example, if you look in the Peace and Conflict Analysis Guidance, there's an annex with probably a page of questions for each of those areas. And I'm obviously not going to go into all of those now, but I've just put a few of them here now. So if you look under security, for example, any generic peace and conflict analysis is going to say, who is at risk, who is unsafe, and why? What are the underlying reasons for that? But from the ILO's perspective, we're probably going to say, well, how does the availability of work impact people's security? So it might be, for example, that the kind of work which is available puts people at risk. If you look at the history of Northern Ireland, for example, there's a long history of people being targeted because of the work they did and being chased out of particular areas of work because they were Protestant or Catholic or whatever it may be. And so similar sets of questions for each of these 5 areas. As I say, these are all in the annex to the PCA guidance, and I won't go into them now, but you can see often they're about exclusion and inclusion, they're about grievances, they're about opportunities to resolve grievances, or whether those opportunities don't exist. And in stage 3 is where we take the step back and we try and bring it all back together and say, what does this mean for our program design or our project design or our project adaptation or whatever it may be, the reason why we entered into the PCA in the first place. So we have a sort of worksheet approach to this, and this can be done very, very effectively in a workshop. So even if a consultant has been leading or even doing most of the analysis up to now, they can bring the data back and then use this sort of worksheet approach to make sense of all the data. So we've got these 4 key questions in a sort of linear way. What are the key peace and conflict dynamics we've seen, and how does decent work interact with these? What are the opportunities to contribute to peace through ILO activities? What are the conflict sensitivity risks, the risks of doing harm, and how do we mitigate those in this context? And then what are the programming recommendations that we can take forward to the next step? And I apologize for the next slide, and I don't expect you to read it all, but it's just there as an illustration. So those are the same 4 questions. And this is actually a shorter version of what's in the annex to the Peace and Conflict Analysis Guidance. There's a worked example in the guidance. So this is where we've got a situation where we've got rural insecurity. There's an armed group which is operating due to ethnic marginalization. There's displacement. Both of the main ethnic groups, including the dominant one and the marginalized one, perceive themselves to be quite excluded by the national government. There's intergenerational conflict. There's economic problems because agriculture is the main economic dimension, but it's increasingly marginal. There are few employment opportunities. We are all familiar with these kinds of contexts. There is, however, donor interest in developing an employment opportunity project. And that's an opportunity for ILO to think about. What are the opportunities to contribute to peace there? Well, can we see if we can reduce the shared feeling of neglect by bringing people together to plan and implement development programs? Can we focus particularly on young people to improve cohesion and reduce their sense of alienation and improve their sense of belonging? Can we build this program, for example, on infrastructure and value chain development, which links to these opportunities in the urban market, which have been identified? Can we make sure that we select value chains which are inclusive from a gender and an ethnic perspective? We think we might be able to, but there are some conflict sensitivity risks. The armed group might perceive this project as being something they want to sabotage. And maybe the key value chain links are dominated by one ethnic group. Maybe the merchants are all from one ethnic group. So we develop some ways of mitigating these problems. And then we bring all this down into these programming recommendations, which in broad terms are improving the economic prospects of at-risk young women and men. So we're going to focus on youth, on this value chain development leading to the supplying the urban markets. We're going to make sure that both ethnicities are engaged in the program, and we're going to make it something which involves local government and civil society as well as urban businesses, so that the pull of the market is exploited. We're going to strengthen dialogue and relations between the ethnic groups and between the generations. And we're going to implement the conflict sensitivity mitigation measures I've already mentioned. And we probably think there's room for a partnership here between ILO and perhaps a gender specialist organization, and some others. And then finally, what do we do with all that? Well, it depends on the context. If we're doing a strategy, if we're adapting a project, we're designing a new project. But essentially, what we just saw on the last slide should feed into whatever design processes is going on. And critical elements to this should be that the piece element has to be integrated completely. It's not something which just added on as a nice to have. It really has to be integrated into the theory of change, the monitoring and evaluation system, the plans, the budgets, and possibly even in the proposal approval process. But that will, of course, depend on how the peace and conflict analysis is fitting into the other activities which are going on. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's difficult to present a guide in a few minutes. Definitely, we invite colleagues to go through it. The guide has been shared last week through a minute together with the standard operating procedures for crisis response. So please, colleagues, have a look and see how you can make use of it in your daily work. You know, Phil just mentioned that it's good to look around and see what's happening out there when you do something. So what we did ourselves was first of all asking the support of some experts such as Interpeace, as I mentioned earlier, but also looking at what others such as another UN agency like FAO has been doing or is doing for working on conflict sensitivity and peace responsiveness. And this is where we met a couple of years ago, I think, Julius and colleagues. Julius leads the conflict and peace unit at FAO in Rome. He supports context analysis, conflict sensitive programs design, and understanding how FAO work on building resilient livelihoods and improving food security. He supports the FAO work across the humanitarian development peace nexus and how these can be operationalized. We are in the process of finalizing a new memorandum of understanding in between FAO and ILO, and we are happy also to say that the cooperation along those lines is also included in the new MOU. So over to you, Julius, to tell us your experience.
Thank you very much, Federico, and thank you very much to yourself and Nieves for the invitation to be part of your launch today and your webinar to colleagues. And as you say, I mean, it's been a journey, I think, for a lot of us, and we're all at different points in that journey. So it's lovely to be able to share with you a little bit about where we've come from, where we currently are. Now, to kick this off, hopefully we'll just kind of make it a little bit more dynamic. We recently produced an animation on conflict sensitivity. What is it and why is it important? Which is about 4 minutes long. And before I then do a little bit more detail about which resonates a lot with what you've already presented around the PCA and some of those key points about what we should be doing in our programming. I think Michaela is going to run that for us. So sit back, enjoy, and we'll pick up on some of the key points in a few minutes when that's over.
135 million people worldwide are acutely food insecure. Half live in conflict-affected environments. Reducing hunger and poverty and supporting livelihoods in fragile contexts is challenging and complex work. Community conflicts severely impact livelihood opportunities and worsen food insecurity. These, as well as competition over natural resources, can also drive conflicts, especially at the local level. Here's an example. Say a new watering hole for cattle was built for local pastoralists, and although many similar watering holes had been built elsewhere, the new watering hole led to local tensions and even fighting. Why? Because the watering hole had been built on grazing land that could not be accessed by all local cattle owners. local customs and relationships between different pastoralist groups who had a history of conflict determined who had access and who did not. The excluded cattle owners thought it unfair the other group benefited and reacted violently. Building the watering hole in that location was conflict insensitive. FAO in all its work must endeavour to do no harm. This means minimising any possible negative effects of assistance to people and communities. Otherwise, our activities and projects can create division and can contribute to local tensions. Any intervention can fuel conflict simply by not understanding or taking into account the local context and can do unintentional harm. If emergency cash distribution means that people need to travel across communities that have unresolved tensions, it can make an already difficult situation worse. This could even put people's safety at risk. When only displaced people receive assistance, host communities can perceive that they are being ignored. This is another example of conflict insensitivity. By supporting agricultural livelihoods, building resilience, and improving natural resource management, we can support communities and underpin local peace. When done well, such an approach can provide a space for dialogue and collaborative solutions, and in doing so, make conflict and violence less appealing. It can also reduce tensions over natural resources such as land and water, and enhance local capacities for conflict resolution. For example, pastoralist groups working together to vaccinate their animals but who usually compete over grazing can be an entry point to identify areas for dialogue, building trust and reducing tensions. FAO programs need to be conflict sensitive. There are 3 key steps. Step 1. Context analysis. Conduct a context analysis to identify conflict lines in and between communities, as well as potential drivers of peace. Understand different perspectives, be it farmers, elders, women, or local authorities. Step 2. Conflict-sensitive recommendations. Now that you see the potential impacts of the proposed interventions and how they could interact with the local context, using a program clinic approach, identify concrete, conflict-sensitive recommendations. Step 3. Getting the activities right. To reduce negative impacts and maximise peace opportunities, amend activities that have the potential to do harm, identify activities that could contribute to local peace, and influence the design of monitoring and evaluation frameworks. Conflict-sensitive programming is fundamental. FAO's interventions and activities must be informed and shaped by an understanding of contextual dynamics. This means FAO's support to people and communities will not only do no harm, but can also do more good and contribute to local peace.
You're muted, Julia.
You're muted. Yeah.
It's the first time today. Darn. Okay, well, thank you very much, Michaela, for showing that. And that gives you, I think, a sense of where we are in terms of talking with our colleagues in the field and at headquarters about the importance of conflict sensitivity and understand the context in order to identify opportunities to contribute to sustaining peace. Now, a lot of that you can see, and from what I'm saying, resonates very, very closely with what Phil was saying, with what Nieves was talking to. So a lot of this is there are a lot of similarities. And indeed, you know, we've gone through a lengthy process, I think, over the last few years to try and identify how we can improve what we're doing, be more systematic, be more consistent, be more coherent. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But before I put up a couple of slides, I mean, one thing to note is that you guys have a 100-year experience grounded in your foundation, which links decent work with peace. By the same token, in FAO, the very first session of the first conference in 1943 stated, "The FAO was born out of the need for peace as well as the need for freedom of want. The two are interdependent. Progress towards freedom from want is essential to peace." There was an identification right at the beginning, post-Second World War, or as the Second World War was closing, similar to being embedded in the Versailles Treaty, that these are opportunities to contribute to peace. And in a way, we recognize that FAO has done that in the 70-odd years of its history. But sometimes it hasn't been called contributions to sustaining peace or indeed peace building. And that's an important reflection, because from all of that accrued experience, and Phil mentioned that he trained as a forester originally, a lot of that came through some particular technical thematic areas. Community forestry, for example, or work around irrigation are two key areas of animal health, as the example we used in the animation, are technical entry points to be able to encourage dialogue between groups, to identify opportunities, how we can do what we're actually already doing, but do it in a different way to have a different kind of an impact. Okay, I'm just going to put up a couple of slides quickly just to run through some of the points that I'd like to share with you. So this is where we are now. We have a number of people, both at headquarters in Rome, but more importantly in our sub-regional resilience teams in Nairobi, Amman, and Dakar, who support country offices in context analysis and conflict-sensitive programming, as well as a roster of experts that we can draw on, and project-specific consultancies. As Phil mentioned earlier, you know, it's not always possible to have that capacity within the organization. Sometimes we do have to bring support in. In addition, we have a long-standing partnership now. I call it long-standing, certainly strategic, with Interpeace. And this is very much where the work that we've been doing in the last few years has been grounded in, and the field testing of that work. And the wee blue guy on this slide here, who's pulling at a spider's web, is one of the images that we use. And it's really to kind of highlight the point. It's like, well, you can pull on one bit of the web, but how does that resonate somewhere else? So that's really about understanding context. And as has been mentioned, all of this complexity and interlinkages. And just because you think you're doing good and your intervention is going to achieve something positive in one place at one point in time doesn't necessarily mean there aren't possible repercussions. And if you're not aware of that, then you have the risk of being conflict blind and doing harm down the left-hand end of the screen. Very similar to the diagram that Phil put up in his presentation. And I guess our reflection and why we kind of thought about this some years ago and immediately after the World Humanitarian Summit was, we want to make sure that we're not there, that we're not being conflict blind, that we're not negatively affecting the context or community relations. And being honest, we know that there are cases where that has happened. We are aware of that, and there are risks associated with that, not just in terms of impact on individuals and communities, the success of an intervention, but also reputational risks and risks to partnerships, both with national authorities, but also with partners as well. And we recognize also that there were opportunities for us to be more peace responsive, to contribute to peace. And when I say peace, I mean that I think that function diagram equation was actually very useful. But predominantly it's about what we could call the little p. It's about the local level. I mean, and for FAO, it's very much as we mentioned in the animation, around natural resource management, around community relations over access to natural resources, as well as inter-community relations around livelihoods and livelihood support. So how did this come together? Well, there's no small part of it was a bit of serendipity. There was a grouping, should we say, of different elements coming together, including the World Humanitarian Summit, getting language into some key publications within FAO, the state of food insecurity in the world, recognizing it's incumbent on the organization, given the state of food insecurity and the links between conflict and hunger, that we are looking at the other side of the equation as well, and understanding that where are some of those entry points, where are some of those pathways that we can identify to help mitigate some of these impacts. The partnership with Interpeace, the opportunity with the political will to develop a corporate framework which looked at how FAO's role over 7 decades had been contributing to peace at the local level, and understanding what some of those starting to understand what some of those pathways were within the context of the Sustaining Peace resolutions and the SDGs, and recognizing that SDG 16 and the other SDGs, but particularly for us, SDG 2, SDG 1, are completely interrelated. And then working through a process over recent years to develop the capacity, having a couple of positions in the organization so that we have a core capacity to draw on, but also how there is an expectation and the demand-led process that donors increasingly, and absolutely correctly, are saying, well, show us your workings. You're saying that you're not doing any harm, but what are you doing to show us that you're being proactively and consistently conflict sensitive, or to try and be conflict sensitive, to understand the context, and particularly the UK, the Dutch, and many others, Scandinavians as well. It's an expectation, and it's something that we need to be able to address, but also it's basic good programming at the end of the day. It's part of all of that suite of analytical work that we do when designing programs, to make sure that we are getting it right. And most recently in the last year, particularly working with Interpeace, it's been reflecting on those pathways and those theories of change in a lot more detail, kind of unpicking some of those experiences that we know were there over the last decades, but haven't really been explored in detail, and trying to come up with more of an evidence base, but also a much more practical guide to colleagues in the field, like, well, how are you going to develop your monitoring and evaluation framework? What are the indicators that you need to look for? What are the pathways that may be options within a particular intervention in a particular context that can contribute to peace? And this has also led to a positive reaction, relationship with the Peace Building Support Office, with PBF, and other donors. And I could call it brand recognition, but understanding that there is a role for FAO and a valid recognition for FAO's role in and through livelihoods in rural areas, that it is important to address underlying drivers, causes, sometimes structural, sometimes proximate to peace. And that this is a process that we need to go through and improve upon within the organization. And just to give you a bit of a sense of that, we have developed a guide to context analysis. I won't dwell on that. You've got your own PCA, but there are a lot of similarities. And it's looking at, where are those entry points, informing the peace contributing logic, the theory of change. So for example, they've just been launched, the Peace Building Fund Gender Youth Promotion Initiative. So in that design phase, you need to understand how gender influences gender conflict dynamics, and conversely, how different groups are affected by the impacts of conflict and insecurity. And here you can immediately see, and this is often questions like, this is yet another analysis we have to do. But here's an overlap with existing analysis that you may be undertaking around gender, or for example, in our case, on value chains in a particular food system. Another tool that we've developed, which we call the Program Clinic, but is similar to what was already developed, but this has been done very much from an FAO perspective, given our thematic areas of focus and our mandate, is trying to identify conflict-sensitive opportunities and conflict-sensitive requirements for intervention design. We know what conflict sensitivity means. You know, you put something in, it can cause issues. So how do you make sure that what you're doing, what your intervention is, doesn't reduce potential negative impacts, but can accentuate positive impacts? And this really is a shift to taking that analytical work, that contextual understanding, and kind of putting it through a participatory process. And this is designed to take no more than a morning. So a few hours with the right people in the room, a facilitator, to go through the 5-step process and to say, okay, well, what could be some of the conflict sensitive risks? How could we address those in our project design? And ideally, you want to be doing that right at the beginning before you've written the concept note, the project document. You can do it in the inception phase. If you have to, because things have moved on, okay, midterm evaluation point. That could be another opportunity to course correct as necessary. Some of the pathways, which I mentioned earlier, and these are our kind of like 7 major pathways, which are, you know, they reduce the potential for violent conflict, should we say, and increase the prospects for local peace. These are the ones which we're just finalizing, we're reviewing within the organization, but also with selected partners outside of the organization as entry points to support program design. So to take pathway 2, for example, you know, how can FAO strengthen, you know, FAO can strengthen formal and/or informal conflict management mechanisms. Now, a key one here is right now working a lot around transhumance, working a lot on mobility of pastoralists and agro-pastoralists. And in that context, where you have traditional or customary institutions or practices which have been undermined possibly by conflict, by protracted crises, how can those be identified, supported, but also in the context of what other conflict management mechanisms may exist, or others which have been layered on top. So it's getting that nuance right, but strengthening those management mechanisms so access to and use of natural resources, pasture, water, for example, doesn't escalate into something more problematic. And there's the links here, for example, to social capital, vertical and horizontal. So pathway 4, you know, around equity and inclusivity of access across community members and social groups, and between social groups and local authorities. And there are a lot of opportunities around community engagement, and we have a particular methodological approach, which we got the Demetra clubs in sub-Saharan Africa, which started off as a way of disseminating good agricultural practices using solar-powered radios, but have now become a process which we can use to have broader discussions between groups about maybe more substantive and more sensitive topics. And that's proven to be quite a useful entry point through a technical point originally, but then to widen the discussion a bit and to unpick what some of the dynamics actually are. So very quickly, and I think you kind of discussed this already in the presentations, but you know, the various processes, tools, and in a project cycle, you know, going through from concept note idea through to inception phase, ideally how you would want to structure this and how the context informs various aspects. So obviously targeting at the left-hand side, the level of stakeholder engagement, your overall objectives, components, into your formulation process, bringing in your context, conflict analysis, bringing in your program clinic, looking at specific activities, helping inform the meal framework design, again, revisiting targeting, stakeholder engagement, and then through to your inception phase and right the way through to project validation, you know, using this as an adaptive programming approach, that you have a contextual understanding, revisiting that on a regular basis, course correct as necessary. And obviously using this as a way of ensuring that you've got your indicators supported by regular monitoring, baseline, midterm, etc., and looking at two things. You know, are you deliberately contributing to local peace? You know, what are the indicators around that? But also, are you being conflict sensitive in implementation? And this has already been mentioned in terms of perceptions, grievance mechanisms, and so forth. So a lot of similarities with what's already been said. So I guess this is by way of saying, is like, you're not alone. You're there with a lot of other agencies, funds, and programs who are, you know, working on the same area. We have the same kind of enabling context in the last few years. I think we have the same recognition and awareness of why this is important and essential to the work that we do. There are a lot of opportunities for partnerships and for us to be more deliberate about this. And from the poll at the beginning, where between knows and don't knows, there was 60% around are you being conflict sensitive? Well, that links very closely with the reaction that we got from a wider poll we did with our country offices 3 years ago now, start of 2018, which threw up a very similar kind of set of figures. Very few people kind of knew for sure that they were being, and then you had to pick at it a bit, and it was like, okay, there's work to do here. So we have to move forward and work on how we can develop this further. I just want to leave you with a few reflections. So it's an ongoing process around demystifying what we mean by peace and conflict, because they are strong terms, they're strong words, and they can encourage quite visceral reactions. So we need to be careful how things are framed and what we understand by them. Language matters. We work in the UN system. We have member countries. We have engagement with them. Some have different opinions than others. And that little box is from the FAO Council a couple of years ago, which really was around language, saying, okay, well, we don't want you to talk about doing peace building in FAO, but please find it's okay for you to refer to FAO's contributions to sustaining peace. Fine, that's the language we use, but the content's the same. We are conflict sensitive, we identify the opportunities. It is a mindset and it takes time. So you're in for the long haul. And it is about change management, I think, ultimately. Really important to identify those pathways, those theories of change, and keep testing and revisiting them, because they evolve to some degree and you learn from experience. Measuring the impact and building the evidence base, well, that's critical to items 1 and 2 in terms of demystification and addressing concerns over language or political considerations. And I think one of the most important from my perspective and for my team is being humble. You know, what can you genuinely achieve within the scope of your mandate, within the scope of the interventions that you do, be it around decent work, be it around supporting agriculture, food security. And that links very much to what Nieves said around avoiding those assumptions. You know, this idea that, okay, if we do this, it will automatically lead to this outcome around peace. We also need to avoid the over-egging of the pudding, to coin an English phrase, where there's a sense that, okay, if we do this, yes, we've shown that there is a causal relationship and that this will definitely result in solving the conflict in this particular area. These are far more complex understandings, hence we need to go through the conflict and context analysis. Rein in our expectations, nuance the language, but keep doing good and trying to do more good. So I'll leave it there. I hope that was helpful and a bit of an insight to, let me see where I can turn this off, a little bit of an insight into some of the work that we've been doing. Happy to take questions, and glad to be working with Interpeace and with ILO and with other agencies on this topic most recently and as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Julia. Indeed, working together on this, it's also reassuring for us to see that others are doing the same. We are running out of time. I kindly propose to stay 10 more minutes for those that they have time. We have just a few questions, and I kindly ask the three of you to go through in literally one minute answer if you can. So the first one from Asfa Kidano in Pretoria. I read, do you have it in front of you as well, panelists? If you take the peace equation functions at face value, it seems to imply that all underdeveloped or developing countries are conflict areas. Is there a threshold to designate a country conflict area or not peaceful? It's a complex question, Asfa. Indeed, sometimes it's difficult to define what is conflict, what is not. I also have another couple of almost provocative question for the panelists, and you decide which one you want to pick. First, how can we make sure that the PCA doesn't become or is not perceived as a burden, for colleagues in the field, that they are actually facing a lot of challenges in terms of timing devoted to the implementation of the project. So what is the recommendation that we can provide them? And another one, often conflict analyses are expensive and they are done after the project has been fully designed. So it has been clearly presented by Phil the opportunity to fully understand, even thinking about intervening in a contest, fully understand the context. So how can we make sure that we do some conflict analysis? And let me add one question from myself, and then over to Nieves. How can we make sure that we don't use and see the conflict analysis as an assessment to be done and parked on our table or somewhere, but we actually use it and we refer to it throughout the implementation of a program or throughout the work that we do in a country? Nieves, you have 1 minute.
Wow. Yeah, okay. Okay, very quickly then. To Afshak's question, I think that's why my presentation, I try to refer as much as possible about fragile contexts, because I don't think today we can just limit it to conflict affected zone. As you even look at the PPF eligible countries, you have a lot of countries in Central America which are not directly in a conflict today, but are still considered as eligible and a priority because there is a strong youth gangs, a lot of violence against indigenous people, violence against women, and all this is now really considered part also of the peace building process. So we're not just talking about war. And actually, when we look at what's happening with COVID-19, and we see a lot of social unrest in the US, in Europe, etc., we can see that we really have to address grievances and conflict drivers even in developed countries. So I would actually say that when we talk about PCA, it's really beyond underdeveloped or quote unquote or conflict affected zones. So it's really beyond that. It's pocket of fragility, of potential fragility. On the PCA burden, I think what is quite important is the conflict analysis can be fully embedded, as I think Julius really mentioned, in other assessment. And we really push also our colleagues, and we've been working with several colleagues also in the framework of Prospect and other programs, that any kind of assessment, labor market assessment, child labor assessment, etc., that we include that conflict sensitivity dimension to it. That's also important. So assessment that you would have conducted anyway, to really make sure that you include that. So, and actually it's even more important, I would say, to be conflict sensitive and to mainstream in every single aspect of your work and assessment. So you make sure to, and at the same time, I'm replying to the last question of Federico, that it's fully embedded into your programmatic approach. So once you have your labor market assessment, if it's conflict sensitive, the conflict driver would be assessed at that level, linked to access to different labor market and value chain also assessments, and that you also develop specific activity to address those drivers. And so that's also why it's so important that it's fully embedded then into your M&E system too, and that it's not just something that you do at the beginning and then you leave it out. I mean, conflict is ongoing, so you really, and it's changing all the time. So you really have to ensure that you follow up. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, you answered to the 3 questions. Phil, over to you.
Just very quickly on the first one, because I presented that equation. Look, conflict is in our lives Conflicts within my family, within my village, within my town, within my country. And, conflict is a good thing. You don't get development without ideas, and ideas always have opposite ideas. And so peace is really when you have the capacity to absorb conflict and move on. And that means managing and resolving the conflicts. Conflict comes when there's stress. If we have the capacity to absorb the stress and manage the stress, then it doesn't become violent. So there's no country which is free of conflict. It's about how we organize ourselves to manage them. Sometimes people call that governance, whatever. I think on the issue of, I agree with Neves that, it's not a one-off. That's why I talked in that final slide about integrating the outcome of the PCA into your furniture in your house, essentially your log frame, your theory of change, etc. So it becomes part of the normal way of looking at things and what you're measuring and what you're focusing on. You hire staff who know about it, so they wanted to work on it. All those sort of normal things, just like any change management. I think how to make sure it's done and it's not a burden. I think, in the PCA, we kind of said there's various scenarios where you can use it. Look, ILO is full of very creative people working right across the organization. Those creative people can talk to Federico and Neves, they can look at the PCA document and they can say, yeah, we do need to do something, but we don't have the capacity to do this 5-6 month analysis or whatever. What can we do? The key question is pragmatically, what can we do which would help us to understand what's in the context, how it's going to interact with what we want to do, and make sure that what we want to do changes accordingly, and then we continue to monitor, kind of thing. And I think it's, we tried by all measures to avoid saying in the PCA that you have to do it by numbers, ABC. We know that in ILO, nobody implements the program design cycle like the manual says. We know it's the same in FAO. We know it's the same in every organization I've worked for. Treat peace and conflict analysis the same. Be creative, find a way to integrate it. If you've only got a morning, then do what you can do in a morning, but be comprehensive. Don't just focus on a narrow bit. Try and look broadly, but do what you can do. So I could go on forever. I'll stop.
Thank you very much. It's very much a mindset,
Yes.
An approach. Julius.
Okay, I think it's pretty much been covered by Neves and Phil. On the first one, I just say you should always be conflict sensitive. So given conflict is endemic everywhere, so just bring that to the table all the time. How to avoid a PCA being a burden? I think there's a lot of scope for joint analysis, which is not actually done now, and we should be exploring that more, especially as we have all of these other issues around collective outcomes and work around CCAs and so forth. So I think the joint thing we need to think about. And on the last one, to make sure that it doesn't end up as a report gathering dust on the bookshelf. That's why we developed the program clinic, so you can actually take that and treat it. So there's a link between analysis and program design. So something along those lines, basically. Have a filter that you can take the analysis and kick out something that's programmatically relevant.
Thank you, Julius. Thank you very much. Also, let me give the floor quickly to Martina for some closing remarks from you.
I wasn't expecting that. You caught me off guard.
Yes.
No, it's been, I think, really great to share these different pieces today on where ILO is coming from, what the PCA is as an added new piece of the puzzle, and hear from FAO about their experience. And I think it's been really exciting to see also the great interest and attendance. I've been looking at the number, and there's still around 50 people here. It hasn't actually dropped much, so that's really great to see. And I think there's really strong potential to build on the strong foundations that are already there and continue to take these conversations forward and to take practical actions in the programs, in as Phil just said, and I think as we all have been saying, in very pragmatic ways, in alignment with your mandate. And where the strengths of the ILO lie, and just identify those additional opportunities that may exist and find ways to be even more deliberate about seizing them and integrating them and embedding them into your work. And I think that's really exciting, and I really look forward to continuing to work with ILO from our side, from Interpeace's side, to take these conversations forward and identify what else we can all do together to practically continue to move this agenda and move these ambitions forward practically in your work. So very, very exciting to be here and see the great interest as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Let me just conclude extremely briefly by starting with a sentence that our regional director for Africa, Cynthia, said a couple of weeks ago in another workshop. Peace is everyone's business. You know, it's so simple, but so deep, this concept. So doing conflict sensitivity, tackling those issues, tackling root causes in what we do, I think it's fundamental for the success, for the impact of our work in fragile settings, but also, as colleagues mentioned, in every kind of environment. The PCA is one of the tools that our unit, CSPR, is trying to offer to our local colleagues with the great support. Great to know, Julia, that we are not alone. I like what you say, and with the great support of partners that they know more than us about how to engage in conflict sensitivity, such as Interpeace. So thank you very much. Definitely to be continued. We have a number of tools that have been presented earlier by Nieves, but it's definitely an attitude, you know, and cooperating with other organizations. I'm thinking, for instance, the framework for action that ILO and UNDP are implementing, including in the Nexus, and several other areas with UNHCR, with many partners. It is really something that shows us the way we can definitely do more. We can definitely, as Phil just mentioned, and you helped me very much in the concluding remarks, doing something, you know, keeping and understanding the importance of having this kind of set of mind, this kind of approach when dealing with this situation. I think this is a great start, and yeah, indeed, Martina, there are a few colleagues that they are still with us. I don't want to keep them too long, depending on also on where you are, on where they are, but I really thank you very much. Do not hesitate to contact us if you need extra support. We are the unit is here to support you. The minute last week shared with you the guides, so have a look at it, read it, use it, and don't hesitate asking questions or even criticizing it. If this is not, it becomes that burden, that's why that question, let us know so that we can see how we can support better in this challenge of promoting peace. So I think it's very much all our panelists and all our attendees here today, and looking forward to speak to you again in the next Peace and Resilience talk. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, everyone.